There's absolutely no doubt that Scappaticci was Stakeknife, and you can quote me on that. And I mean, it's almost comic in the report, the extent to which it's clear from how Boucher writes it that he's identifying Scappaticci as Stakeknife, and yet he's not actually saying Scappaticci was Stakeknife. So he's abiding by the letter of the law. In other words, he's trying to follow the government's neither confirm nor deny policy. But it was very clear in the press conference, he's not happy about this. And I think this touches on a much broader point, which comes across very strongly in the report. John Boucher has said repeatedly that for people in Northern Ireland to move on, there needs to be less secrecy, there needs to be more openness about what took place during the Troubles, and in particular, the secret war that was waged. And I think this policy of not naming Scappaticci as Stakeknife is a really good example of that.
Now, earlier this morning, the Police Service of Northern Ireland released its long-awaited report from Operation Kenova, the 7-year investigation into the activities of Stakeknife. Stakeknife, if you don't know, was the Army's top agent who was undercover as a leading IRA member during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. He's been accused of murdering another British spy and many other people. This is John Boucher. He's head of Operation Kenova. He addressed a press conference in Belfast earlier today.
I strongly believe it is now time to bring the uncertainty and doubt these families have faced to an end and say to them officially, you are not mad. This was happening, and this should not have happened. During the Troubles, state agents were at the heart of a deadly battle between the security forces and the Provisional IRA. The security forces used agents to provide them with intelligence about the IRA and other groups, and this played a vital role in disrupting and degrading its capabilities. Society owes many of these agents and their handlers a huge debt of gratitude. In response, the IRA did everything it could to deter and punish possible agents. In particular, the group's internal security unit was responsible for punishment beatings and shootings, securing coerced confessions, and the abduction, torture and murder of suspected agents.
And here is John Boucher explaining what that spy, Stakeknife, actually did.
Stakeknife was the code name for an army agent within the IRA's internal security unit, whose true identity has been the subject of public claims, speculation and litigation for some 20 years. While Stakeknife was undoubtedly a valuable asset who provided intelligence about the IRA at considerable risk to himself, claims that he was responsible for saving countless or hundreds of lives are hugely exaggerated. Most importantly, these claims belie the fact that Stakeknife was himself involved in very serious and wholly unjustifiable criminality whilst operating as an agent, including murders.
Well, joining me now is Henry Hemming, the author and espionage expert, whose forthcoming book is all about Stakeknife. Afternoon, Henry.
Afternoon, Patrick. Good to be on the show.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. And what a day for us to be having this discussion, and what a time to have published a book about Operation Kenova. For people on this side of the Irish Sea, Henry, you're in Belfast right now.
Yeah, I've just been able to see the report earlier today.
Yeah, indeed. They might be familiar with the name Stakeknife. They'll know about the Troubles. But just talk us through, for those who aren't familiar, what Operation Kenova has been looking into over the past 7 years.
Sure. Operation Kenova was set up back in 2016. And it's a criminal investigation into the activities of this agent Stakeknife. But it also, and this is what sets it apart, it's also looking at the people who ran Stakeknife and not just the agent himself.
So he's sort of MI5 handlers, basically.
Yeah, he's an army agent. But I mean, the first thing to say is the scale of Operation Kenova is almost without precedent. This is the largest murder investigation in British history. You had a team of 72 detectives. They took hundreds of witness statements. They went through thousands of documents which had never been seen before by previous investigations, which have been in the archives of MI5, the local police, but also the army. So it was a forensic investigation. It uncovered a lot of new material, but it's led to no prosecutions. So this report that came out today is, in a way, the test of what this Operation Kenova is able to achieve. It has not been able to provide justice. Can it provide some truth? And I think by and large, it has provided a lot of truth. It's been a really interesting report.
And what have we learned from the report that wasn't already in the public domain? I mean, having read parts of it, what strikes me most is just how, and this seems like a sort of pat or cliche conclusion, a lot of it is pretty horrifying. It concluded that the IRA's internal intelligence unit, which Stakeknife helped to run, they called it the Nutting Squad, more often than not tortured and killed suspected informers, not because they were informing, but in some cases to get rid of people so they could sleep with their wives and a huge amount of that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that Boucher got absolutely right in the report. Most of his focus in terms of where the blame should lie is aimed squarely at the Nutting Squad. It's not aimed at the agent handlers. It's not aimed at the people above them. It's very much the IRA Nutting Squad, which at one point in the report, he says, was responsible for the worst things that any human can do to another. So it was reprehensible what they did. What he's also really clear about is how reprehensible it is that some IRA leaders refused to criticize what the Nutting Squad did, even many years after the event, even given what we now know. And he's called, I think rightly, for Republican leaders to apologize. And I think just earlier we heard Michelle O'Neill beginning to do that. He's also called on the British government to apologize for times in which the security forces were aware of a threat to someone's life and did not act. And usually this was trying to protect one of their agents. But I think one of the things the report makes clear is that there were times when lives could have been saved and probably should have been.
And that is the great imponderable for many people at the heart of this, the thing that's quite difficult to grasp, given the intensity of feelings on both sides and the intensity of the conflict in Northern Ireland. It's one, how could someone at the very heart of the IRA's Nutting Squad, whose description speaks for itself, end up in the pay of the British Army? And how was it that the British Army thought so much of what Stakeknife was doing was tolerable as a sort of price, particularly because the report today has concluded that the sort of fiction at the heart of the Stakeknife story, i.e. this was all worthwhile because he saved many hundreds of lives, is just that, a sort of consoling fiction, and at most he maybe saved a couple of dozen people.
And you're right, Boucher talks a lot in the report about the mythology. He keeps talking about the legend of Stakeknife, the myth of Stakeknife. And this is something I get into in my book, 4 Shots in the Night. The story of Stakeknife is one which only begins to make sense when you look at the wider impact of his intelligence. So I think Boucher is absolutely right, that if you look in a really strict interpretation of it, at the lives that were directly saved as a result of particular information that Stakeknife passed on, there's probably only about 10 lives that he saved. But if you look at the times when his intelligence corroborated other information, or indeed, if you think about the times when he passed on stuff to his handlers that was never written down. And then I think the third thing, just beyond that, is the feeling of mistrust and suspicion that his activity created within the IRA and the effect that had on the organization. And there's many other people who've written about this, who've talked about how that paranoia within the IRA contributed to it no longer functioning in a military sense that it once did. And that in turn contributed to a situation where you could have the Good Friday Agreement and you could arrive at peace. So I think there's definitely a different interpretation of exactly what his intelligence did. And that's something I get into in 4 Shots in the Night.
And this was a guy clearly who had the trust and the ear and was often with the leadership of the IRA, was privy to all the discussions about their political direction, particularly in the 80s and the 90s when they were debating whether to move to a more political strategy as opposed to one that was solely or predominantly defined by the terrorism for which they were so notorious. And Stakeknife obviously informed his handlers about that. And as you say, the political impact of that is much more difficult to measure or keep track of. I mean, just before we talk about the politics a little bit more, Henry, we've been talking about Stakeknife throughout this discussion. Do we know who Stakeknife was? Stakeknife was, because this is contested. Obviously, the intelligence services have this policy of neither confirming nor denying who any agent is. Lots of people who have read the Times this week will have seen Sean O'Neill's excellent reporting about Stakeknife as Freddie Scappaticci, the former IRA man who died fairly recently. And the report today confirms that it was one person, not a collective of people. But Scappaticci always denied that he was Stakeknife, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And there's absolutely no doubt that Scappaticci was Stakeknife. And you can quote me on that. And I mean, it's almost comic in the report, the extent to which it's clear from how Boucher writes it that he's identifying Scappaticci as Stakeknife. And yet he's not actually saying Scappaticci was Stakeknife. So he's abiding by the letter of the law. In other words, he's trying to follow the government's neither confirm nor deny policy. But it was very clear in the press conference, he's not happy about this. And I think this touches on a much broader point, which comes across very strongly in the report. John Boucher has said repeatedly that for people in Northern Ireland to move on, there needs to be less secrecy, there needs to be more openness about what took place during the Troubles, and in particular, the secret war that was waged. And I think this policy of not naming Scappaticci as Stakeknife is a really good example of that. And he's called on the government to be able, to name Scappaticci as soon as possible. There's going to be another report later this year, the final report, and with luck, that will name him finally. Yeah, but I think carry on.
And John Boucher, as you say, went as far as he could to name Scappaticci without naming him. He said it was one person. He said he's dead, and both of those apply very much to Scappaticci. I mean, just to conclude, Henry Hemmings, we're talking about the political impact of this. Obviously, Northern Ireland has just, after a long period of hiatus, just formed a power-sharing executive again between Sinn Fein and the DUP. Sinn Fein polling very strongly in the south of Ireland, where traditionally their Republican past, the IRA Sinn Fein link, indeed, meaningfully the same organisation for much of its history, has always been a bit of a historical hangover for them. They look like they're getting over that. As you said, the Republican movement, the British government, both need to apologise, according to this report. Michelle O'Neill sounding emollient, the Sinn Féin leader in Northern Ireland and First Minister of Northern Ireland, but not quite apologising. It's not what Sinn Féin do about the IRA, because it sort of, demolishes their version of Irish history if they do so. But do you think they'll come under huge pressure to say something more than, we recognise the pain caused on all sides and, let's move on, without looking this sort of stuff in the eye and saying, we're drawing a line?
I think they will. I think you're absolutely right. And I think a really similar thing happened with Martin McGuinness. And this is something I talk about in my book, Four Shots in the Night. McGuinness, to begin with, denied any of the allegations about his IRA past. And he continued to do so until he ran for president in 2011. And that's when he really began to face up to his past, because a lot of stories emerged at that time. And in the years that followed, he changed. He changed his approach. He began to acknowledge what he had done. And I think he achieved some kind of resolution with his past. In other words, it is possible for someone in a senior Sinn Féin role to change their stance and to directly acknowledge and apologise for things that happened in the past. So I think you're right, there will be more pressure. And I believe there probably will be a different stance in the months to come.
Well, we'll see. Of course, Gerry Adams, leader of Sinn Féin for so long, never, ever acknowledged, and still hasn't acknowledged, whether or not he was in the IRA, as many people say he was. Let's see if there really has been a generational change in Sinn Féin. That's one of the tests John Boucher has put before the Republican movement today, and Let's see if the British government apologises for this. And that's another of his recommendations. Henry Hemmings, really, really good to speak to you.